Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Delia. We put a lot of thought into the topics that we wanted to cover during this 8-week worm topics. And the first one, the Periparturient egg rise, to me is one of the most important topics. This is kind of where it all starts. This is the primary issue with worms, where it starts. And so I like to think it's timely for those of you who've lambed a little earlier. This information was important earlier, but hopefully it tends to be most important for those who lamb and kid in the springtime. So first of all, what is the Periparturient egg rise? Sounds like a fancy word. Periparturient, parturient around the time of parturition, or lambing and kidding. So it's around the time of lambing and kidding. And so what it is a temporary loss of acquired immunity to parasites around the time of lambing and kidding. It is normal for sheep and goats to develop immunity to parasites. The problem is it takes a while, and the very young ones are very susceptible because they don't have any immunity yet. But the mature animals have developed immunity. That immunity is stronger in sheep than it is in goats, but still, they develop immunity. And what happens is when they get to the time of lambing and kidding, they lose some of that immunity that they have acquired as they've been exposed to parasites and as they've gotten older. This Periparturient egg rise is exactly what it sounds like. It's an increase in fecal egg count. And also, the increase in fecal egg count is due to an increase in the number of worms in the intestinal or gastrointestinal system of the sheep and goat. What causes it? They don't know exactly what causes it, but it's believed to kind of be a combination of how hormones are around the time of parturition are suppressing immunity, and also the nutritional stress by the fetuses and by the nursing lambs and kids. Around lambing and kidding means it starts in late gestation, or can start in late gestation, anywhere from a week or two before, continuing through early lactation, which would be about the first 6 to 8 weeks of lactation. A lot of different factors affect when the Periparturient egg rise occurs and the magnitude of it, but it tends to peak about 30 days after lambing and kidding. Why is it important? What's important is twofold. And again, I say the Periparturient egg rise is at the very core of our parasite problems. So if we look at from the perspective of the ewe or the doe, if she is parasitized, she is going to produce less milk. She is going to produce milk. She's going to have a shorter lactation period. So research has shown that parasitism can decrease milk production by 10 to 15%. There's also evidence that clinical mastitis is more common in parasitized ewes. Okay, but probably the bigger problem is not so much the ewe or doe, but what impact does that have on the lambs and the kids? Well, first of all, if she's producing less milk, having a less persistent lactation, experiencing more mastitis, obviously lambs and kids are not going to grow as well. But the bigger thing we often think about is when she poops onto the pasture, she is going to be depositing more worm eggs. Those eggs are going to develop into infected third stage larvae, more contaminated pastures. Those kids and lambs, which don't have immunity yet, are going to ingest larger numbers of infected worm larvae, which in turn is going to affect their growth rates and potentially their survivability. So that Periparturient ewe and doe, especially in the springtime, is the major source of parasite infection for these lambs and kids in the springtime, and in many climates that continues on into the summertime. It's like she's seeding the pastures in the springtime for what's going to come in the summertime, what we used to call the summer explosion. Spring rise, summer explosion. Those are common terms that have been used in the world of parasites in small ruminants. What are some of the contributing factors to this Periparturient egg rise? Well, one is high production, both in terms of multiple births, but also in terms of lactation, like a high-producing dairy doe. How old is the ewe or doe? We know that younger ones are more susceptible. Poor nutrition makes sheep and goats And along with that, poor body condition makes them more susceptible to everything. And so we have a higher periparturient egg rise, higher fecal egg counts when nutrition is poor and body condition is poor. Anything that you would classify as poor management, stressing the does or ewes, overstocking pastures or pens, overgrazing, anything that's a stress, transportation, predators, the neighbor's dog, all of those can be contributing factors to the periparturient egg rise. And of course, the season, what the weather is and what the climate is also going to have a lot to do with the magnitude of the periparturient egg rise. So every sheep and goat producer needs to have a strategy or strategies for coping with this problem. And I'm going to go through each one of these: deworming, nutrition, season, zero grazing, condensed tannins, BioWarmup, and genetics. Now, these strategies are on top of things that you should already be thinking about and doing with regards to controlling parasites, how you graze, things like that. But this, we're going to talk about strategies that are specific to the periparturient egg rise. Control the periparturient egg rise, and we may do a good job, get a head start in controlling parasites in our lambs and kids. Okay, the first strategy is deworming. And this is the traditional age-old strategy for dealing with the periparturient egg rise. The traditional or old recommendation was to deworm all, notice I have it in yellow, bolded, all the ewes and does around the time of lambing and kidding or before turnout to spring pasture. I say around because it was originally believed that the best time to do it was before, 2 to 4 weeks before, maybe the same time you handled them for their C&D injections, maybe the same time you sheared them for wool sheep, okay? Some people, it was easier to do at the time of lambing and kidding, when she's in a jug. And then some people did it after. And it was considered to be good management was earlier the better. But anyway you look at it, it was to do it around the time of lambing and kidding. The problem with that strategy is it selects for resistant worms. The more we deworm our animals, the more resistant the dewormers get, especially if we do all of them, because we don't leave any worms that remain susceptible to the dewormers. The other thing to keep in mind is when you do deworm, we need to make sure that the treatment's effective. And combination treatments are now what's recommended for a clinically parasitized animal. This is particularly true if you follow the new recommendation. And I would highly recommend you follow the new recommendation, which is we're still deworming potentially, but we're selectively deworming ewes and does around the time of lambing or kidding or before we turn them out to spring pasture. So we're not doing all of them. We're selecting who we treat. Okay, and so how do you select which animals should be treated? Well, we've got a lot of tools for that now, or a lot of criteria, a lot of thought that can go into that. So we have a term we call targeted selected treatment, or TST for short. And what this means is, again, it's choosing who needs treated and when. Who needs treatment, who would benefit the most from treatment. And this doesn't just apply to the periparturient female, but to all of our sheep and goats, cattle, alpacas, llamas, anything we raise. Treat animals that need it. Don't treat animals that don't need it. So in the case of the periparturient female, we're going to use the FAMACHA system, and hopefully most of you are certified in using the FAMACHA system and you have a FAMACHA card. If not, there's a lot of online training that's going to be available now, and of course we'll go back to live trainings once things resume to normal. So the first criteria is to deworm any ewe or doe that has a FAMACHA score of 4 or greater, so 4 or 5. From a color standpoint, that's like a light pink or a white. You need to deworm those females. You need to deworm them with an effective treatment. If you don't know which dewormers work on your farm, you should. But if you combine dewormers, the recommended combination is usually at least levamisole and cydectin. Put some, we'll cover that in a webinar in about 4 or 5 weeks using the dewormers properly. The next criteria is to deworm ewes and does with a body condition score of 2 or lower. We body condition score sheep on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being emaciated, 2 being thin, 3 being average, 4 being fat, and 5 being obese. So a thin female. If she's thin, when she's approaching lambing and kidding, she is certainly below what we want her to be, and it's a good idea to deworm her. We should deworm any female, such as the one in this picture, that has 3 or more offspring. We have a lot of sheep and goats that have triplets, maybe not so many that have quads, but if there's 3 or more offspring, we should deworm them. We know that the more offspring they have, we know that they're going to have a higher periparturient egg rise. We know those lambs don't get as much milk. We need to give these animals that advantage. We should deworm first-time mothers, this particularly yearlings. So does and ewes that are 12, 13, 14 months of age, having young for the first time, we know that they're more susceptible to the periparturient egg rise and should be dewormed, especially if they've got 2 or more offspring, okay? The last category you should probably deworm or should deworm is a high-producing dairy female. Done a lot of work in Europe where they've targeted deworming on that high-producing dairy goat. So she's under greater production stress, so we should deworm her. So those are the criteria that we should use for deworming our periparturient females. You got a ewe or doe with a single, you got a fat one, don't give them the medication. Only give the ones who need it or would benefit from it. Okay, the next strategy is nutrition, and nutrition is twofold. There's both a static, which is what is their body condition, versus what I call a dynamic, is what is their plane of nutrition. So I already mentioned a ewe or doe that's in poor body condition score of 2 or below is more susceptible to parasites around the time of lambing and kidding. So first, she should be targeted for deworming during that period of time. But better yet, you need to make sure you don't have does and ewes at that body condition at the time of lambing or kidding. You need to aim for a body condition score of 3 to 3.5. Again, it's out of 5. I'm not saying 4 and 5, those are too fat. 3 to 3.5, so average plus. That's the condition we want them at the time of lambing and kidding. That way, as they start to lactate, they can break down some of that fat and muscle to produce milk for their offspring. Okay, the other is what's the plane of nutrition to these females? You need to feed more in late pregnancy. Nutrient requirements in late gestation and lactation are higher for ewes and does, especially for those carrying or raising multiple births, and especially for triplets. So if you've got a high producing flock or herd, you really need to make sure that you increase that nutrition. Nutritional requirements especially go up for energy in terms of the fetuses in late gestation, but with regards to parasites, increased protein supplementation can help. So about 1 month before lambing and kidding, before they're due, you need to start increasing the feed. Essentially, we need to feed a more nutrient-dense diet. Usually this means a little bit of grain. Not necessarily a lot of grain, but a little bit. A lot of research has looked into using protein supplementation to counter the periparturient egg rise. And they've shown that this can be effective in ewes. And so when I say protein supplementation, I mean whatever they need, you need to make sure you feed above that. Very often we have a certain kind of hay, and we need to supplement through the grain because we can't do anything about the hay we feed. You know, if you're not feeding like a legume mixed hay in late pregnancy, chances are you're going to need to supplement some protein and probably some calcium in the feed ration in late pregnancy. They've done some work with bypass protein. That's protein that's not digested in the rumen, but bypasses the rumen, gets digested in lower down in the digestive tract. That's been shown to be beneficial for parasites. Remember, the barber pole worm is a blood sucker. The animal loses blood, it loses protein. So a high parasite load affects that protein metabolism at a time when she already needs more protein. So protein supplementation is key. Doesn't mean we should forget about energy, because energy tends to be the most limiting nutrient. But feeding better or feeding proper in the last month of pregnancy will help with that periparturient egg rise. Okay, season. What I mean by season is, in order to reduce the magnitude of the periparturient egg rise, you could lamb or kid at a time of the year when parasites are not very prevalent on pasture. This is usually early winter, so I'm talking about December, January, maybe into February. I'm not talking about March. You know, March 10th is winter, but it's late winter. Or the fall, September, October, November. Parasites are not very active at that time of the year. Because very often, if you read the literature, especially the older literature, you'll see the word periparturient egg rise and spring rise often used synonymously. Actually, they're two different things, but they often coincide, particularly if you lamb or kid in the springtime. So in most climates, the worms go into a hypobiotic or a rested state during the wintertime. Now, there are climate differences, and I know what happens in Florida is different than what happens in Maryland or what happens in Maine. But when the environmental conditions aren't conducive to the worms completing their life cycle, they will go into an arrested or inhibited stage. So when you lamb or kid in the springtime and the weather's warming up, well, those hypobiotic larvae are resuming their life cycle. And then you combine that with the periparturient egg rise, and you can see how the magnitude of that will increase. So keep that in mind. That's why spring lambing and kidding is the most problematic for parasites. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. You just need to realize it's something that you're going to have to figure out how to manage. Because really, lambing and kidding those other times of the year, it's not like they're perfect. If you lamb or kid in the fall in particular, you're going to have lower conceptions rates. You're going to have fewer babies born, because it's most natural for sheep and goats to breed in the fall and birth in the spring. And so there's going to be, reproduction is not going to be as high as it is in those other times. And particularly if you lamb in a lot of climates in the wintertime, you're going to need some pretty good housing, which is going to be an added cost. But season is an option to help manage the periparturient egg rise. Okay, then there's what I call zero grazing, okay? That means lambing or kidding indoors or in dry lot. So no grazing. So even if they're outside in a lot, you need to make sure there's no vegetation, because dry lots can be dangerous if there's a little bit of grass inside or even on the edges, because they will overgraze those and they can be problematic. So we're talking about a situation where they cannot graze. So they're in a barn, they're on slats, they're in a dry lot with no vegetation. If we do this, the pasture is not going to be contaminated. It doesn't mean you're not going to put animals on pasture. It just means during this period of time, they're not going to be on pasture. So the ewes and does aren't going to be contaminating the pastures. They're not going to be depositing worm eggs. Inside the barn or in the dry lot, there's not a lot of transmission of worms in that environment. Worms are transmitted primarily out on pasture when they eat the larva that's on the grass. Okay, not primarily in the barn. Now, in the barn and dry lot, coccidia can be a problem. In fact, I saw a study recently. This was actually a Chinese study, and it looked at parasite levels, worms and coccidia, from confinement to range and then in between. And coccidia was highest in confinement, and worms were highest on pasture. You know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why. Now, to lamb or kid indoors or in dry lot, you need good facilities. You usually need a barn. Again, that's an expense. Dry lot can be a less expensive option, or maybe you can use a combination. Another option is to go ahead and lamb and kid on pasture. Okay, so she's somewhat contaminating the pastures, but when the lambs or kids are weaned, put them into a zero grazing situation. Very common way to raise sheep in a lot of parts of the country. The lambs stay in confinement and go to market, and they never have a parasite issue, and you have the ewes and does out on pasture. I already mentioned that lambing in or kidding indoors or in dry lot, coccidia is still going to be a challenge. It will help with worms, but not necessarily with coccidia. Condensed tannins. Condensed tannin feeds have been shown to reduce the periparturient egg rise in ewes and does. Here we're talking primarily about Sericea lespedeza. A lot of work's been done with that in the Southeast as part of our parasite consortium. Sericea lespedeza is a perennial warm season legume that grows under suboptimal condition. It's been shown to have anti-parasitic effects specifically against the barber pole worm and also about coccidia. So what we see when these animals are consuming these diets is they have fewer eggs and oocysts in their feces and fewer signs of parasitism. This activity has been demonstrated if they're out grazing or if they're eating it in a dry format like hay, leaf meal, or pellets, or even in an ensiled forage. So it's been proven in all of these. If you're interested in learning more about Sericea lespedeza, we have a lot on our website, wormx.info. They do market a pellet, And you can learn more, again, you can learn more about it on the website, but it is another option potentially for reducing the magnitude of the Periparturient egg rise. Most of you by now have probably heard of BioWarmup. BioWarmup is a product that contains a fungus. The fungus is fed to the livestock. It's a feed-through product. It has no effect in the animal, but it survives their digestion so that when they poop, the fungus is in their manure, and the fungus traps and kills the worm larva, not coccidia, not tapeworms, but basically roundworms, not just sheep and goat parasites, but any of the livestock. Cattle, horses, I think even some work with pigs and poultry. And so if we feed it to our sheep and goats during the periparturient egg rise, we are going to reduce the contamination of pasture. And again, one of our primary concerns about the periparturient egg rise, not just the health of the female, but more how she's going to impact her kids and lambs once they start grazing, and her contribution to that pasture contamination. So by feeding it to her, we are actually going to prevent reinfection of the pastures. Not 100%, but the data shows 60, 70, 80% reduction in pasture infectivity when BioWarmup is fed. Now, if she needs deworm, based on those criteria, she's a FAMACHA 4, which is a body condition 2, she's got 3 lambs, you still have to give her a dewormer, but this BioWarmup will also prevent her from reinfecting the pastures. The biggest challenge to BioWarmup thus far, it's a proven product, it's a proven concept, is it can be a bit pricey. So the table I have here is based on the prices for BioWarmup at Premier One Supplies in Iowa. 2 products exist. One is called Livamol. Livamol is a supplement that contains about 2% fungus. It's a ready-to-feed product. Up until recently, that was the only way a producer could buy BioWarmup. Now, BioWarmup itself, the product contains like 34% fungus, is now available for purchase. The challenge with that is the dosage. It's not ready to feed. It's a supplement that has to be mixed in or top dressed onto a feed. But it's only 1/3 of the cost of Livamol. So you can see this. I use as an example, what would it cost to feed a periparturient female? And I did it for basically 10 weeks. So 2 weeks before lambing and kidding and 8 weeks of lactation. And you can see the price difference of what it costs to feed. I used a 160-pound ewe and a 110-pound doe. At least gives you a general idea. And one of the things we don't know is not only might it help like this year, but you're going to be working towards having a less contaminated pasture. So again, this is another option that you have. Another option that you have, and I think it's not a quick fix, it's a long-term commitment, but I think more and more we're going to be looking at genetics as a means of reducing parasitism in sheep and goats, not just the periparturient egg rise, but parasitism in general. And so the first option is, well, heck, you ought to just raise breeds that are more resistant to internal parasites. On the goat side, that would probably be the Kiko, the myotonic. On the sheep side, it would be our hair sheep of tropical origins. It would be the Gulf Coast native. Maybe even a little bit of indication that the Texel has a little bit more resistance than most of our wool breeds. Don't want to raise one of those breeds, but you should cross with them. So we have 2 benefits of crossbreeding: breed complementarity. So if you've got a breed that has a high A counts and one that has low A counts, you're going to probably get somewhere in the middle. But also some heterosis, which is when instead of right in the middle, you're above that middle. You have an advantage of the crossbred to the average of the purebred parents. You don't want to choose different breeds, cross with different breeds. Then you're left with selection within your own breed or your own population. And so what we should do is we should select replacement, particularly females that are more resistant to worms. We should use sires that have proven resistance to internal parasites. And by proven, I don't mean buying a buck on Facebook that the farm says he's more resistant. You need some documentation that he has some resistance. I'll talk about that with the next slide. And we need to cull ewes and does that are less resistant to worms. The only thing I want to mention here is I've already mentioned that higher producers are more susceptible to worms. Therefore, kids out of larger litters are more susceptible. Make sure you, in your selection program, that you don't penalize high-producing females or lambs and kids from large litters. Keep that in mind. Don't penalize them because they are higher production. So there's several ways that you can select for parasite resistance on your farm. The first one's on-farm selection, and I'm going to talk about that in the final slide. The second one is what I call a central performance test, basically a ram or buck test. I've got the University of Maryland crossed out. We did a buck test for 11 years in which we selected bucks for parasite resistance. We kind of ran our course on that program, but there are some options. West Virginia University will be doing its buck test this year. They feed the bucks in a pen, but they challenge them with parasites. Langston University is doing a two-part test, one in a pen and one on pasture. They'll be looking at parasite resistance. As far as I know, Eastern Oklahoma's buck test is still going on, and they also look at parasites among those bucks. Virginia Tech is the only ram test that looks at parasite resistance. The rams are fed on pasture and they're challenged artificially. Also, a lot of those sale rams will have estimated breeding values on parasite resistance. That's number 3. If you truly want to select animals that are more resistant to parasites, you will use estimated breeding values, which are provided by the National Sheep Improvement Program, and they're calculated in Australia by their lamb and kid plan. This is by far the most accurate method of selection. You can enroll your flock or herd and get data back. If you don't want to do that, you can buy, particularly on the sheep side, you can buy rams that have some of that data, particularly on the Katahdin breed. But this is really the direction that sheep and goats need to move into, is these estimated breeding values. But for most of us, you're going to probably look at on-farm selection for parasite resistance. You're going to look within your own animals and try to do the best job you can. The most accurate way to select for parasite resistance on a farm is to do fecal egg counts. If you select on the basis of FAMACHA scores and whether or not the animal needs treated, that's not that accurate. You aren't necessarily selecting for resistance, you're selecting for resilience, which is their ability to tolerate infection. The traits are correlated, but if you truly want to select for resistance, you'll start pulling some fecal egg counts. You can learn them to do them yourself, you can get places to do them. Sometimes there's even money available to pay for it. Though quite variable, resistance in growing animals, lambs and kids, is a moderately heritable trait. Probably about 20 to 40% heritable. It varies by breed, it varies by species. It's probably not quite as heritable in goats. But when you think about twins and triplets, they're only about 10% heritable. So parasite resistance fecal egg count's a lot more heritable. It means you can make progress a lot quicker than actually you can make progress on prolificacy. If you select lambs and kids for parasite resistance, I'm going to tell you it's challenging. And our buck test in Maryland was a perfect example. You have to get high enough levels of infection in order to see differences. The example I'm giving is egg counts over 500 eggs per gram. I would say, personally, I think it needs to be even higher. But in order to get that high enough level of infection, you got a lot of animals that are very vulnerable to parasites, and you're going to have a lot of problems. So it can be quite challenging to select lambs and kids. If they don't have enough of challenge, you're probably not making much of a difference. And then if they have a lot of challenge, it's going to be challenging to keep them healthy and growing. One alternative, and this ties into the Periparturient egg rise, is instead of selecting the young growing lambs and kids, let's keep those guys healthy and growing, but instead let's select on the adults as an alternative method. I already mentioned that the adults, even the adult goat, is more resistant to internal parasites. So they've started to look at the genetics of the Periparturient fecal egg count. And they find that it's repeatable. Repeatable means that if she's low or high this year, the next lambing kidding season, she's going to be low or high. And while not quite as heritable as the fecal egg count in the lambs or the lambs, it is a low to moderately heritable trait in the adult, in sheep. Most of this work's been done with sheep. We hope that it's similar in goats, but we always know it can be somewhat different or not quite as good. So if we were to cull females with high egg counts at the time of parturition, we are going to be able to reduce the contamination of pastures and therefore the subsequent infection of young animals. So they're looking at selecting the adult at the time of parturition as an alternative to selecting on that very susceptible kid and lamb, particularly kids. You know, if you have an animal that they say is resistant to parasites, but there's not a very high level of infection, I can tell you he's not. He's got to show some resistance, and there has to be a high level of infection for that difference to matter. And when we did the buck test all of those years, we had some difficult years in terms of high numbers of animals that were parasitized, at least subclinically, but we consistently had a handful of bucks that would have low fecal egg counts all the way through, not need deworming, have good FOMACHA scores, and be above average in average daily gain. So it's a painful process, but it does work, but maybe it might work better in the adults. So just kind of to conclude, we all need some strategies, and likely more than one, to deal with this periparturient egg rise. If we don't, by the time the kids start to grow and get older, we're really going to be faced with a lot of problems. So in some ways, dealing with the periparturient egg rise is actually kind of a prevention for having problems with the lambs and kids. And so there's different things you can do, and you're not necessarily going to do them all. They may not all be cost effective, but you have to figure out a way to deal with this periparturient egg rise. And with that, I'm going to conclude. I thank you for your attention. Our hopes was to keep these presentations around 30 minutes, and so we could allow time for questions, and so we could try to complete everything within an hour, because we know everybody, even though we're in unique times, we know everybody's busy. We have been recording this, and the intentions are to put it on YouTube. But with that, I will entertain some questions. I'm sure there's been some in the chat box.
Okay, Susan, so there have been a few questions, and I tried to separate them based on you know, topic. But one of the first questions that came up was, how long does it, or how can we clear an infected pasture area? How can we make a pasture clean?
Okay, so there's two kinds of quote, I'm going to say clean pastures. Very often when they use the term clean, we say, well, no infection, no infection. And that's going to take, we usually say that's about a year. It's going to depend somewhat on climate. So more likely we're talking about trying to take a pasture from, let's just say, highly infected to lowly infected. And normally that's somewhere between 60 and 90 days is about what, and again, a lot of these things are going to depend on the climate. Even, you know, on average, the life cycle of the barber pole worm is about 21 days, but it can be different depending on the climate. Sometimes an egg can go from egg to third stage larva in as quickly as 3 to 4 days, or it could take months. It just depends on the climate. But it's about a 60-day rest period. And so a very traditional or very commonly recommended pasture rotation is to move them every 3 or 4 days and not bring them back to the same pasture for 60. And that should theoretically work. Now, in many cases, the eggs aren't developing into larvae that quick. And so you could actually have a longer rotation, but that's basically what it said. So roundabout way to your original questions, about between 60 and 90 days, though it depends on season and it depends on climate.
Okay, thanks, Susan. The next question, and this has to do with Drylotting, and you answered your question during your presentation, as the person who asked noted, but just in case someone came on late or missed that section, what effect does Drylotting have on the periparturient egg rise? And it has different parts of the question too. Does keeping a recently freshened ewe or doe off a pasture benefit the pasture for the rest of the season? And does Drylotting also benefit the kid and lamb, or is the lack of parasites reducing their overall lifetime resistance?
Okay, I mentioned earlier that one strategy, a strategy for avoiding parasites at any time is confinement or Drylot. And again, Drylot meaning no vegetation. There's basically no source of infection or reinfection. The amount of transmission in confinement or Drylot for worms is very negligible. It's not like 100% no, but it's basically very negligible. And of course, the negative side to that is you've got facilities and you got feed to pay for. Okay. Now, so if she's inside, she's not contaminating the pastures. If the lambs and kids are inside, they're not contaminating the pastures. So we're making cleaner pastures with less infectivity. We're doing that. Okay. What effect might that have on the ability of the animal to develop resistance? Well, in the case of the ewe or doe, she's probably already been out on pasture in her lifetime and she's developed some resistance, but we've got these young lambs and kids that have it. And so, you know, they're not, if they're simply going to go to market, it doesn't matter. They don't ever need to develop resistance to parasites. But if these are going to be replacements, if these are going to be ewes and does that you're putting back into your herd, if it's going to be a breeding buck that you're going to be using, you're going to want them to have some ability to develop resistance. So you're going to want to expose them to parasites because they're going to have very limited exposure in confinement or Drylot. You're going to want to get them out. You're going to want to get them out. Market animals, it doesn't matter, but you're going to want to get these replacements out so that they have some exposure. Because in a perfect world, these lambs and kids are born free of parasites and they gradually get exposed to worms and coccidia. And your hope is that that infection level is high enough to allow them to develop resistance, but low enough not to cause clinical disease. Where we get in problems is when the infection levels are so high that they cause clinical disease. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you, Susan. The next question under pastures. If we keep goats in high-growing browse, will that significantly impact their parasite infection and help with that PPER?
Absolutely. If you're a goat owner, and to some extent in sheep too, if you can keep your animals browsing, you can keep their head off the ground, you are going to have a much better control of parasites. Goat was never meant to graze. Goat's a browser. I shouldn't say never because they do some grazing, but the whole way a goat was supposed to deal with parasites is simply to avoid them, just to evade them, graze high, keep its head off the ground. Because even in a grazing situation, they're a top-down grazer. It's sheep who want to push their face into the dirt. So because of that, sheep graze close to the ground. They like short, tender grass. The sheep strategy is to develop immunity. And so they actually do a much better job developing immunity to parasites than goats do. Doesn't mean they do it as quickly as we wish they would, but that's their strategy. So two different strategies. So anytime we can keep the animal grazing higher or we can keep them browsing, we're going to do a better job. If you look at the research, most of the worm larva, that infected third stage larva, is going to be in the first several inches. You know, they'll find some studies where it's gotten higher, but for the most part, it's going to stay near where the moisture is. And so the higher the animal grazes or the animal browsing, you're going to keep them from ingesting infected worm larvae. Okay. But in any situation, most even browse areas, wooded areas usually have a combination of low and high growing forage. If you can work a browse the woods into a grazing program, a rotational grazing program, that can be really beneficial. One of the important things with goats, with browsing, is not to put them in there to clean it out, but to manage it as a pasture, kind of that take half, leave half philosophy. Make sure it regrows so you can put them back in there. So yeah, definitely a great strategy. And strategies that work year round can certainly have a benefit in the periparturient egg rise as well. But you're not going to prevent her periparturient egg rise really by browsing her. She's still going to have that increase in egg count, but she's not going to get reinfected if she browses, and her kids aren't going to be infected if she browses.
Okay, next question. This is more of a management question, and it has to do with the pasture rotation too. So one participant said they close the barn once it gets cold, keep their animals off pasture, and then they open it back up once the weather turns nice, but they only limit pasture to during the day, and they're back up at night. So they wanted to know if that would help.
Well, if you assume, and I don't know if we can assume this or not, but if you spread out when animals poop, let's just say, and they're inside the barn half the time, they're pooping half in and half out. So half the eggs are in the barn and half the eggs are out. So yes, it theoretically should help. But at night, they're also wouldn't be doing a lot of grazing anyhow. I do the same thing, and my sheep stay around the barn at night. They wouldn't even go out. They just kind of hunker down at night and stay and would do all their pooping, around the barn anyhow. But I mean, if you're reducing the amount of time they're depositing manure and eggs onto pasture, then you're theoretically cutting that infection by that amount.
Okay.
And you're protecting them against predators.
Okay. I just wanted to remind everyone too that, and I see that that was put in the chat box, is that we will have a session or a talk on pasture management. So we hope you'll tune in for that one as well. There were like one or two questions on the life cycle. Someone wanted to know what type of climate does a barber pole worm thrive in?
Barber, and the session on May 5th, Dr. Matthews he's going to talk about barber pole worm and a lot of the biology and life cycle of that. He's specifically going to talk about that, but they like it when it's warm and moist, or warm and humid. So we live in Maryland and they love it here during the summertime, especially. The farther south you go, it's going to be those conditions more year round. The farther north you go, there's going to be still going to be a problem, but it's kind of going to be more condensed. So warmth and moisture, periods of summer rainfall, that's for the barber pole worm. The other parasites can have some somewhat different circumstances, but the barber pole worm is by far our biggest one, and it's warmth and moisture, and that's why they in our climate here in Maryland or Mid-Atlantic, they go into that dormancy during the winter. Now, we had a pretty mild winter, so my expectation is that the parasites are coming on quicker and we're going to have more problems sooner. But it's usually in the spring when they resume their life cycle. Again, we're talking the Mid-Atlantic climate. And then when we hit that first killing frost, they kind of start to go into that hypobiotic state. That's just on average. But if it's hot and dry, that's not conducive to parasites. I used to kid people that the best the goats did in our goat test was the years of marginal droughts. Not such a drought that there wasn't anything to eat, but a fairly dry situation, because then they didn't have any parasite problems, and as long as there was enough to eat, they did all right. The goat actually does better in the drought than any other animal. But once it starts, if it's hot and once it starts to rain, that's when we start to get our major parasite problems. Coccidia is probably can be both a hot and moist and a cold and moist. That's more year round almost. And that'll also be the subject of another webinar, will be coccidia, also with Dr. Matthews.
And the other one is, I guess she was trying to ask, in theory, how many eggs could be passed in the manure?
I think Delia might know the answer to that question better than me in terms of, I shouldn't say, I'm sorry, not eggs so much. I was thinking of something else. But when we did Dr. O'Brien did our fecals for our buck test. And I can tell you, there would be sometimes we'd have a bunch of them with no eggs in the feces. And then we'd have ones that, I'm trying to think, that Dr. O'Brien, that record was 56,000?
Yeah, 56,000.
56,000. The thing you need to keep in mind about fecal egg counts is the barber pole worm is a very prolific egg layer. Lays a lot of eggs. And I suspect the percent of those eggs that actually develop in the infected third stage larva is very, very, very small. But there's so many of them that you have that potential for a high level of infection. In our buck test, we considered egg counts below 1,000 to be low. So while 800 might sound like a big number, we consider that to be pretty low for the barber pole worm. 1,500, we used to rate the goats on a gold, silver, and bronze level, and 1,500, we had different levels, but until the egg counts got up above 2,000 for the barber pole worm, we weren't that concerned from an egg count only standpoint. Obviously, we deworm based on clinical signs, FOMACHA scores, body condition scores, average daily gain, but they can be all over the board. They can be zero at times. The expectation is that they will always have eggs. You definitely want to tune in next week because Dr. O'Brien's talk is fecal egg counting primer. She's going to talk about how to do it, but also what to do with that information, because what to do with that information is probably more important than how to do it. It's not that hard to do, but yeah, they can be quite high without them being problematic, or depending on what kind of parasites you have, they can be different. Coccidia have to be really, really high as well before they're considered clinically problematic. And anyhow, I don't want to, I'll let Dr. Brian go into it.
Okay, then one of the other questions. Someone asks that if they don't deworm often, if they don't deworm their animals often, could they just stick with the dewormer they have that everyone is telling them that's not effective anymore?
So if you don't have to deworm very often, and I'm going to say not that you deworm very often, but you don't have to deworm very often, that's good.
Mm-hmm.
Pat yourself on the back because you must be doing something right. But just because you deworm and you don't have problems doesn't actually mean the dewormer works. So I would say if you're convinced that the dewormer that you're using works when everyone tells you it doesn't, test for it. There's two ways to test for dewormer resistance. And again, Dr. O'Brien will probably get into that next week, but you can just simply do before and after fecal egg counts. You can do this with individual animals and you can do it with a group of animals. I do the same animals. And you look at what happened before and after. And then you can answer your question. Don't worry about what other, one thing you always have to worry about with worms is don't worry about what other people think, what your neighbor does or what works for your neighbor. Because every situation is different. When we as a group, my colleagues and I say that this dewormer is probably not effective, it's based on a lot of testing that's been done on farms. We've done a lot of resistance testing on farms in the Mid-Atlantic as well as the Southeast. And we can tell you on average what the results are, which wormers aren't very effective and which wormers tend to be more effective. But realistically, it could vary, and your farm could be unique, your farm could be different. So simply test. Test to find out if that dewormer works. And yeah.
Okay, next question. We've got about 5 or 6 questions left, and I wanted to get them in before folks start leaving. But regarding combination deworming, you mentioned that as a treatment for using TSD. Won't that build up resistance to each individual dewormer?
If you were to use a combination treatment and you gave it to all of the animals, you didn't selectively choose who needed deworm. You gave it to all of them. Yep, that's exactly what it would be doing. It'd be selecting for resistance to all of them. But hopefully, you're not doing that. Hopefully, you are selectively choosing who needs treated. So maybe you've got 20 animals and only 2 needed it, but those 2 that needed it needed to be treated, and so you gave them effective treatment. Because the whole purpose of a combination treatment is simply to kill as many worms as possible, to leave as few surviving as possible. And so, but it's imperative that that be selectively applied. Whether you're using 1 dewormer, 2 dewormers, or 3 dewormers, you should always selectively apply that strategy. Otherwise, you're always accelerating resistance. Resistance is inevitable and it's always happening. And what we're simply trying to do is we're trying to slow the rate of resistance. There's some evidence that the combination treatments may actually, some work in New Zealand shows that they may actually restore some efficacy of the old dewormers. there's one study, and I'd like to see it repeated, where valbazen and copper oxide wire particles were combined. And the study showed that resulted in an effective treatment, and valbazen is considered to be one of those wormers that's not effective. So that's kind of neat, but I think the study needs to be repeated. But yes, don't deworm them all, or you will be selecting for resistance to all of them.
On another, on the same topic, that is, do you think, is there any update on when a combination dewormer in a single drench will be available in the US?
My gut feeling is it's not likely. The sheep and goat industry are very small, and the probability of getting a combination dewormer, I don't think is very high. Which is a negative if you're a relatively large flock. If you're not a really big flock or herd, individually dosing those drugs shouldn't be that big a deal. But yeah, it's possible that they come out with a combination treatment. Is it probable? We haven't even gotten the 2 new dewormers that are on the world market, and we're probably never going to get them. So chances are you're going to have to do them individually. And I'll make the point, it's pretty darn important that you do them individually and not mix them. I mean, you can read stuff and people can tell you, well, it's okay to mix them, but you shouldn't. They're not chemically compatible. They should not be mixed. So sorry, I can't really give you what you want to hear on that one.
Okay, so you mentioned that you should increase nutrition the last month of pregnancy to help with that rise, that periparturient egg rise. Even though increased nutrition will help with that, won't there be an increased chance of pregnancy toxemia? And should producers be concerned about that?
Actually, those two go hand in hand and are positively correlated. Pregnancy toxemia is caused by an inadequate intake of energy during late pregnancy. And so one of the reasons we have to increase their nutrient intake, their nutrient density, their energy intake is to prevent pregnancy toxemia. And so they actually go hand in hand. The question might be alluding to the fact that a fat female is more prone to pregnancy toxemia, but you can't deny her nutritional requirements. Because when I talk about feeding in late pregnancy, I'm talking about meeting the nutritional requirements for energy. I'm not talking about it. Protein you might increase above the requirements because we're talking about parasites, but we're not talking ever about increasing energy above her nutrient requirements. We're not ever talking about that. But fat females, yes, they are more prone to pregnancy toxemia. I don't want to overfeed her in late pregnancy. I want to meet her nutritional requirements. And better yet, and I can't always do that, I don't want her to get fat. I don't want to get a female, I don't want to have a female in a body condition score of 2 at Lamb kidding, but I also don't want her at 5 or 4.5. I can tolerate 4, but 4.5 or 5, she's too fat, and you needed to take care of that beforehand. And I realize we don't always get that done, and then we're ended up with this female that we got to deal with. But a fat female will break down the fat on her back if she's underfed into toxic, and that breakdown of fat will cause these toxic ketone bodies, which will cause pregnancy toxemia. So again, meet her nutritional requirements. Try not to let her get fat. Okay.
You mentioned here sheep as being resistant. Could you provide specific breed examples? And has there been any research done out there to discuss differences in breed and which crossbreds provide specific benefits?
There's been a lot of research all within the last 10 to 15 years looking at parasite resistance. And our most resistant breed is the St. Croix. In fact, it's used as a model for research. The St. Croix is a Caribbean breed. It's from the Virgin Islands. Okay, so that's our most resistant breed. You could actually raise those sheep and use them to vacuum up your pastures. You could use them in a crossbreeding program. They're the most resistant breed, and they have a very high level of reproduction. Problem is they're small and they don't grow very fast. That's the benefit of crossbreeding. We combine the good and bad of different breeds. A lot of research is focused on the Katahdin, which is half St. Croix. And we find research has shown that the Katahdin is between the St. Croix and the wool sheep in terms of its resistance. The Barbados blackbelly, which Dr. O'Brien has at her research center, they're kind of like the St. Croix in terms of resistance. I just don't think there's nearly as much research that we have on them. And then we have a different form of the blackbelly that most people have, which is the American blackbelly. And I'm not aware really of any data on them. You'd expect some similarities, but they're not quite the real thing, so it's hard to know where they fall. So the Katahdin tends to be intermediate. The Dorper, which I jokingly say is not really a hair sheep, sorry if I offend anybody, but it's from a different part of Africa, South Africa, not from the more tropical climate, and so most of the research would say no, they're not resistant to parasites. Years ago, I remember a study that said they might have a little more resilience, which resilience is the ability to tolerate, but really not a resistant breed. On the wool side, the Gulf Coast native, one of the most underappreciated breeds in the United States. A lot of data on Gulf Coast native, Louisiana native, Florida cracker. Those breeds have a lot of potential for resistance. The Texel breed in recent years, as a wool sheep, as a terminal sire, is shown some evidence that it may have some resistance. Not quite like the St. Croix, certainly not the same magnitude and not even the same manner. And West Virginia University is doing a lot of good work with the St. Croix and the Texel, looking at resistance. Did they ask about goats? I'll ask goats as well. Sadly, on goats, we don't have near as much data as we'd like to have on goats. And I don't think we can definitively say state breed differences. We have some data that would suggest that the Kiko and the myotonic would be have some resistance compared to the other breeds, particularly I think the boar pretty susceptible. Savannah, I think is I don't know. I don't know that there's any evidence that would suggest it's any different. And dairy breeds would assume to be pretty susceptible. Angora is pretty susceptible.
Okay. How can I access more information on getting involved in testing my bucks for parasite resistance?
So if you want to test your bucks for parasite resistance, again, there's the central buck test, the 2 in Oklahoma, the 1 in West Virginia. And you could contact, I could put you in touch with any one of those. As someone who did a buck test for 11 years, I can tell you that we're doing the buck tests, ram tests do very little to advance the genetics of parasite resistance. They're mostly a marketing thing. If you truly are interested, you'll get involved in the National Sheep Improvement Program. And even though it has sheep in its title, it's sheep and goats. And better yet, you'll get a group of breeders who are like-minded, and you could kind of start a breeders group and start collecting that data. That would be, you know, if you just want to kind of sort of get started, you might put bucks in the test, but if you're really serious about it, you'll submit data to the National Sheep Improvement Program. Kid Plan, Australia Kid Plan.
Okay, just 2 or 3 more questions. Which dewormers are safe for pregnant females? And I know this will be addressed in
Yeah, we'll be addressing this in the dewormer one, but just to let you know, the only dewormer that is problematic for pregnant females is albendazole, which is valbazen. If you read the label, it says, do not give in the first 30 days of pregnancy or 30 days after the male was removed. So it's early pregnancy, it's caused abortions. So most people, they just stay away from it for all of pregnancy for that reason. But it's primarily in the early part of pregnancy. All the rest of them, when they are administered properly according to the label, they are safe for pregnant females.
And another participant asked, do you always deworm a ewe with triplets, regardless of adequate body condition score and good FOMACHA score?
Do you always? I guess that's, you know, a lot of choosing who you're going to deworm, they are judgment calls. And my thought on a female with triplets, I suppose you could have a 3 or 4 year old ewe with triplets that's in really good body condition, and your thought is, well, that she can handle it physically, and she probably may well can. Maybe she's depositing a lot of eggs, because we know that ewes with triplets tend to have higher fecal egg counts. So I would probably deworm her. Do I have to because of her physical condition? Maybe not.
Okay.
But we're going on the idea that she's going to have more eggs, and unless every single ewe in your flock has triplets, we're trying to select out the ones that we think would benefit the most from it.
Okay. So besides TSD, one producer mentioned that she used herbal worming with her milking dairy goats. In your opinion, is she wasting money?
A lot of emphasis, or there's been a lot of work trying to look at herbal dewormers, or for lack of a better word, the non-synthetic dewormers. And none of them really have proven to be effective in terms of our traditional research. So traditional research would be, we would look to see if it improved or reduced fecal egg count, and maybe compare it to a synthetic dewormer. And when we do that, we find that with the exception of copper oxide wire particles, none of them have proven to be effective. Now, if you give something natural and it improves their immunity, or if it makes you a better manager, but when we simply look at whether it reduces fecal egg count, we haven't really found much. Even when they fed condensed tannins, instead of them consuming them through the forage, they fed them. They still did. They didn't work. They helped when they're part of the forage, but when they actually tried to take them out and feed them, they didn't work. And a lot of research is going to continue in this area. We're going to keep looking for plants that are bioactive. We're going to keep looking for stuff. But right now we haven't found them. I mean, a lot of work's been done. Dr. O'Brien and Dr. Matthews have both been involved in, I think Dr. Wickley too, have been involved in looking at alternatives. And so far, copper oxide wire particles are the only one that's been consistently effective. And the Sericea lespedeza, when you graze it, it's not like a dewormer, it's more like a preventative, And so, so hopefully in times to come, so I would say, getting back to your questions, it depends on how expensive it is. It's probably not hurting them. Is it helping them? One of the things I always tell people, if you think something works, you have come up with some magical mixture that you think works, do a little test. Get a SARE grant. Give it to half of them and don't give it to the other half. Work with the county agent or one of us to do a little trial. That's how we, a lot of times if we don't know, we can test things. I have somebody's going to ask me if somebody wants a question answered about using tobacco. We have a program next Monday in Kentucky, and they want to know about tobacco. And, there's a lot of old time beliefs and old time things that were used, but a lot of times we just don't have proof that they work.
All right. What about deworming lambs and kids? How early can you start?
There's no age limit on lambs and kids. Usually, keep in mind the barber pole worm needs a rumen, so they don't really have much of a rumen when they're 3 weeks old. But there's no real age restrictions on them. Milk provides protective, when they're nursing. A lot of times lambs and kids get really parasitized after you wean them, because there's when they're nursing, I'm not saying they can't get parasitized, but there's some protection to that. So I'm not going to say how soon you should deworm them. I'm going to say when they need it. So age has nothing to do with when they need it. If you've got month-old lambs and kids that need dewormed, you've got some serious problems. I mean, worming is not going to solve your problems if you've got lambs and kids that need it at a month of age. So there's no age restrictions on dewormers, but you should only deworm when they need it. Coccidia drugs are different because those are very importantly timed when kids and lambs are young, and Dr. Matthews will talk about that. But there's no safety issues. It's just that, like I said, if you're having to deworm before they're a couple of months old, you probably got some serious problems.
Okay, and do all of these things work with cows and horses as well?
A lot of the wisdom and philosophy is the same regardless of species. Sheep and goats have a lot bigger issues with dewormer resistance because they are more susceptible to parasites than cattle and horses, and I think that's made us have to focus in many areas. But there's a lot of dewormer resistance with horses. So I think you're seeing some changes in philosophy there. Horse doesn't get the barber pole worm, so you don't have a FOMACHA system to use. So fecal egg count, fecals mostly should be used to make deworming decision on horses. Just like sheep and goats, horses shouldn't just be routinely dewormed. A lot of the same pasture management, a lot of the same strategies are going to be the same because we're talking about the worms, not always necessarily the species. Cattle aren't as susceptible to parasites. They have a little cross infection with the barber pole worm, but for the most part, again, the philosophies are similar. We can use these different animals in combination with sheep and goats, so complementary grazing, mixed species grazing that may provide some benefit for both species because they're, generally speaking, they have different worm species. But yeah, most of the stuff is pretty similar. We still deworm cattle for no reason. A lot of people don't deworm cattle and they say they don't have a problem, and then we have people that deworm cattle that probably have some resistance issues. We're actually going to do a study in Maryland. We're going to try to get some baseline data on beef cattle to see what the level of resistance to some of the commonly used dewormers.
Okay. Susan, I think you should, I'm going to stop right now. There are 3 questions that were just posted, but I think maybe at this time we should pause to do the poll. And then if those folks want to stick around, then we can answer those questions. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to do that. I think you have to go into polls. So everyone who's still on, we're just going to ask you to do a quick poll for us to just or administrators expect us to evaluate our program. So we need to provide some feedback, and it's good for us too, so that we know who makes up our participants and what kind of programs you're looking for in the future. So please take a minute or 2 to do that. It's pretty fast. Thank you.
Goats are winning. Meat is winning.
So I guess since we started it, we could go ahead, Susan, and address the last 3 questions. So one participant asks, at what fecal egg count would one deworm during PPER?
I would, you noticed I didn't include it in the criteria.
Mm-hmm.
I probably wouldn't even do a fecal egg count. I would use the criteria that I talked about, the FOMACHA score, the body condition score, the number of offspring, the high level of milk production. And the reason I wouldn't use fecal egg count, because I could use a fecal egg count in addition to that information, but I would never use a fecal egg count as the only reason for deworming. Because I think it's hard to say specifically. If you were to ask all 4 of us that question, I think we'd all 4 come up with a different answer. I think, to me, what I would consider a high egg count, it might differ by season, it might differ by species, it might differ by the female herself. In our buck test, if we had a FOMACHA score of 3, we were looking for a fecal egg count above 3,000 before I would consider that a reason to deworm. Now, I'm not saying I would use 3,000 as the answer to your question. I would probably go much lower than that, but I would probably depend more on those physical criteria. Know your animals. Look at your animals. And I don't know if Dr. O'Brien would or anyone else would want to add to that, but I would use the criteria. I mean, chances none of those criteria is on the border. I'm not, if you had a FAMACHA 3 and everything, but if you meet any of those criteria, there was a study that I was really impressed with out of Canada, and they had 4 criteria, and they were FAMACHA body condition score, the age of the female, and the triplets. And I think that's just a pretty good set to deworm. And I always throw in a high producing dairy female, because we're not necessarily talking about number of offspring, but one of your high producers, I would deworm. And then keep in mind, there's no harm in deworming. When in doubt, deworm it. Just don't do them all.
Mm-hmm. This question is a little, maybe going into the deworming topic that I think you will present later on, Suzanne, but I heard that sheep eating pine needles helped with worms. Any truth to that?
I think pine needles have condensed tannins in them or something,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where that theory comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a lot of research that's been done in, I guess it's Alabama, about pine bark.
Yeah.
And so I would say it's very limited proof. Is it going to hurt them? No. Is it going to solve all your parasite problems? No. But there may be some, just like bark, eating bark, pine bark.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of too complicated to know if pine needles themselves would do the job. But it's certainly not going to hurt them. And one of the things we would like to achieve in raising sheep and goats is simply to figure out ways to greatly minimize the animals that need treated, treat them when they need it. But what are all the many things we can do? And maybe pine needles is one of them that are going to minimize the number of animals that need it treated.
Okay. Okay, so that was the last question, Susan, and we went over 20 minutes. So I think this is a good point to end our weekly topic for today. Thanks to everyone who participated, and we look forward to seeing you here again next Tuesday when we'll do our fecal egg count primer.